Two arrogant cops think they can bully a homeless black man, until they realize he's the deadliest Green Beret sniper in history. But by the time they figure it out, it's already too late. It was a bitterly cold evening in downtown Chicago. The streets were nearly empty, save for a few late-night wanderers and a handful of people huddled under makeshift shelters. Among them sat James "Ghost" Carter, a 62-year-old homeless black man, wrapped in a tattered military jacket, his beard streaked with gray, and his piercing eyes scanning his surroundings. To passers-by, he looked like just another forgotten soul, discarded by society. No one knew that beneath the worn-out layers was a legend, a former Green Beret sniper, the deadliest marksman in US military history. A man who had once taken down high-value targets in the dead of night, who had saved countless American lives overseas. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, he was just another black man struggling to survive on the streets. The night air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked pavement, a dull mist hanging low over the streets. Neon signs flickered weakly, their glow reflecting in puddles that stretched like cracks across the broken concrete. The city never truly slept, but in this part of town, where the forgotten and the forsaken lived, it barely stirred. James "Ghost" Carter sat against the cold brick wall of an abandoned storefront, his duffel bag resting beside him. His worn-out boots were propped up on a discarded milk crate, his tattered jacket pulled tight against his body. He wasn't asleep. He never really slept, not in places like this. Instead, he watched, listened. He heard them before he saw them. The low rumble of a police cruiser rolling down the street, the crunch of tires over shattered glass, the quiet murmur of a radio cutting through the silence. Cops. James didn't move, didn't flinch, just waited. The police cruiser pulled up to the curb, its headlights illuminating the alley like an interrogation room. The doors swung open, and out stepped Officer Weston and Officer Simmons, two patrolmen who had spent years working the streets, but never in the way that truly mattered. They weren't here to protect. They weren't here to serve. They were here to assert control. Weston was the first to speak, his voice sharp with the kind of authority that came from knowing he had a badge and a gun to back him up. "Hey, you can't be sleeping here." James slowly turned his head toward them, his eyes cold, unreadable. He said nothing. Simmons shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't new to these kinds of situations, but something about this man, the way he sat so still, so unbothered, felt different. Weston, mistaking James's silence for defiance, took a step forward. "I said, get up." His hand hovered near his baton. A small, unnecessary gesture, one meant to show dominance. James exhaled slowly, not in frustration, not in fear, just measured, controlled. "Didn't know sidewalks had a curfew," he murmured, his voice deep and steady. Weston's jaw tightened. "Don't be smart with me, old man. Stand up." James could have complied, could have made things easy. But there was something about the way Weston spoke, something in his tone, in the way he carried himself, that told James exactly what kind of cop he was. The kind that thought the badge made him powerful. The kind that thought men like James had already lost. James didn't move. Simmons glanced at Weston. "Come on, man. He's not bothering anyone." But Weston wasn't the type to back down, especially not in front of a rookie. "He's trespassing." James let out a dry chuckle. Trespassing on what? The sidewalk. Weston's face darkened. That was the thing about men like him. They hated being questioned, hated the idea that someone they thought was beneath them could have the audacity to push back. His patience snapped. "All right, that's it." He stepped forward, reaching down to grab James by the arm. And that's when it happened. Fast, precise, controlled. James's hand shot up like a striking viper, his fingers clamping around Weston's wrist in a grip so tight, so unrelenting, that the officer immediately froze. For the first time he felt it, the sheer power behind this man's hands. James didn't squeeze, didn't twist. He didn't need to. He just held him there. For a moment, nothing moved. Weston's face contorted in confusion, then in something much closer to fear. James slowly lifted his gaze, his eyes meeting Weston's with an intensity that sent an involuntary shiver down the officer's spine. And in that moment, Weston knew he had made a mistake. Simmons took a step forward. "Weston, let's just." James released Weston's wrist. Weston jerked his arm back like he had touched a hot stove, his heart hammering in his chest. He covered it up quickly, masking it with anger. "That's assault on an officer," he spat. "I could take you in for that." James smirked, leaning back against the wall. "If that's what you want to call it." Weston's nostrils flared. He wasn't thinking anymore, just reacting. He grabbed his baton, pulling it free with a sharp click. "You think this is a joke?" James watched him, his expression unreadable. "I think you should put that away," James said calmly. Weston sneered. "Or what?" James didn't answer. Because deep down, Weston already knew. Simmons stepped between them. "Weston, stop." His voice was more urgent now. "Something's off about this guy." Weston ignored him, his grip tightening on the baton. "Stand up." James sighed. He had given them every chance to walk away, every opportunity to make the right decision. But men like Weston, they didn't know how to back down. Slowly, deliberately, James shifted. Not in a way that was overtly threatening, but in a way that set off alarm bells in Simmons' head. His posture adjusted, his weight shifting in a way that only trained eyes would recognize. This wasn't the movement of a homeless man. This was a soldier preparing for combat. And then it happened. Weston swung. A mistake. The mistake. James moved with the kind of speed that should have been impossible for a man his age. His hand shot up, catching Weston's wrist mid-swing. But this time, he didn't just hold it. He twisted. Weston gasped as his own baton was yanked from his grip and sent clattering to the pavement. Before he could react, James swept his leg behind Weston's, knocking him off balance. The officer hit the ground hard, breath whooshing from his lungs. Simmons reached for his radio, but James had already taken a step back, hands raised in a deliberate show of restraint. "Don't," he said quietly. "I'm not your enemy." Simmons hesitated, his pulse hammering. He looked at Weston, his partner, a trained officer, on the ground in seconds. And in that moment, he understood. They had never been in control of this situation. Not for a second. Weston scrambled to his feet, his face red with humiliation. "You son of a—" Simmons grabbed his arm. "Enough." His voice was firm now, his hand gripping Weston's shoulder. "We need to leave. Now." Weston's pride burned like an open wound, but he saw it in Simmons' eyes. The urgency, the fear. And then, in James's eyes, the cold patience of a man who had seen war and had walked away from it, but could go back in an instant if pushed. Weston took a shaky breath. "This isn't over." James smirked. "It never started." Weston turned on his heel, storming back to the cruiser. Simmons hesitated for a moment, then nodded at James, not as a cop, but as a man who had just seen something he couldn't explain. Then they were gone. James exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. He had given them a chance. Next time, they might not be so lucky. The tension in the alley grew thicker with every second. James' ghost, Carter, remained seated, his expression calm but unreadable. He had faced men with real power before, men whose orders could end entire regimes, whose mistakes cost lives in the thousands. But tonight, the only power these two officers held was the illusion of control, the authority granted to them by a badge and a city that often turned a blind eye to abuse. Officer Brad Weston sneered, his hand tightening around his baton. He was the type who thrived on intimidation, who measured his worth not by how he served his community, but by how much fear he could instill in the people he saw as lesser. To him, James was not a man. He was an obstacle, a stain on the clean streets that Weston believed he had the right to clear away. "You heard my partner, old man," Weston growled, taking a step closer. The smell of cheap cologne and stale coffee clung to him. "Get your ass up before I make you." James exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the frigid air. He had been in situations like this before, cornered, outnumbered, underestimated. The difference was, back then, he had been in the jungles of Vietnam, the deserts of Afghanistan, the frozen landscapes of Eastern Europe. The men who had tried to intimidate him there. They were ghosts now, memories buried beneath layers of time and regret. "I ain't causing no trouble," James replied, his voice calm, steady. "Just trying to keep warm." Weston exchanged a glance with his partner, Officer Kyle Simmons, a younger cop who still had the nervous energy of someone trying to prove himself. Simmons wasn't as hardened as Weston, but he wasn't innocent either. He had spent enough time under Weston's command to know that questioning him meant weakness. And in this line of work, weakness got you replaced. "Keeping warm," Weston scoffed. "You mean loitering?" James didn't answer. There was no point. Simmons nudged James's knee with his boot. Not hard enough to hurt, but enough to test him. "Come on, man," Simmons muttered. "Just move along, all right. Don't make this a problem." James slowly lifted his gaze, his sharp, battle-worn eyes locking onto Simmons. For a brief moment, the young cop saw something different. Not the face of a homeless man, but the face of a soldier who had looked death in the eyes and walked away victorious. Something in Simmons hesitated. But Weston, he didn't see it. He only saw defiance. The older officer's face twisted with irritation. "Man, I'm sick of this," Weston muttered, reaching down and grabbing James's duffel bag. Before James could react, Weston ripped it open and dumped its contents onto the cold pavement. Medals clattered onto the ground. A stack of old, worn photographs fluttered in the wind. A folded green beret, carefully tucked away, landed near Weston's boot. Simmons' jaw tightened. "Jesus, Weston." But Weston wasn't interested in what he had just uncovered. He was looking for a reaction. He wanted James to lash out, to give him an excuse to draw his baton, to pin him to the ground, to remind him who had the power here. James's fingers clenched into fists. Not out of fear, but out of restraint. He had been trained to endure pain, to ignore hunger, to suppress emotion under the most brutal conditions. He had been tortured in ways that these men couldn't begin to understand. But this was a different kind of torture. To have the symbols of his service, his sacrifice, his very identity discarded like garbage. It burned in a way no battlefield wound ever had. Weston nudged the green beret with his foot. "Well, well," he said mockingly. "Looks like we got ourselves a war hero." Simmons looked visibly uncomfortable now. He wasn't expecting this. He had thought they were dealing with just another vagrant, some nobody who would scurry away at the first sign of trouble. But this was not what he signed up for. "Maybe he got kicked out," Weston continued, his smirk widening. He turned to James. "That it, huh? Dishonorable discharge. Bet you got caught stealing from your own squad." James had faced death and won. But in this moment, it took everything in him not to let the soldier inside take over. He inhaled deeply, his body relaxing, not because he was weak, but because he knew that these men were beneath him. They had never faced the horrors he had seen. They had never felt the cold grip of mortality on their throats. They were children playing at war, and James, he was the real thing. "Didn't get kicked out," James finally said, his voice controlled. "Retired. Honorably." Weston chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah. Then what the hell are you doing out here?" James didn't answer. He didn't owe them one. Weston's patience was wearing thin. He squatted down, bringing his face closer to James's. "See, that's the thing," he said, voice low and condescending. I don't like liars. And right now, I think you're lying to me. Simmons shifted uncomfortably. He didn't like where this was going. Weston, maybe we should. But Weston wasn't listening. He reached forward and grabbed James's jacket, pulling him forward just enough to show dominance. And that's when it happened. James's entire posture shifted. It was subtle, so subtle that Weston didn't notice. But Simmons did. James wasn't a victim anymore. He wasn't a homeless man sitting in the cold. He was a predator assessing his prey. His eyes, once tired and distant, became sharp and calculating. His breathing slowed. His muscles, though old, moved with the precision of a man who had trained his body to kill with absolute efficiency. Simmons took a step back. Weston. Weston was still grinning, still oblivious. Until James moved. In one fluid motion, James's hand shot out, gripping Weston's wrist with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for a man his age. Before Weston could react, James twisted, not enough to break it, but enough to make him understand who was really in control. Weston gasped, eyes wide. He felt it now. He felt the truth. This wasn't just some homeless man. This was a man who had killed more people than Weston had arrested. James held Weston's wrist a moment longer, his grip firm but controlled. And then, just as quickly, he let go. Weston stumbled backward, shaking out his hand. He looked at James, really looked at him, for the first time. And he saw it, the ghost. Simmons grabbed Weston's arm. Let's go, man. Now. Weston hesitated, but the fear in his eyes was undeniable. He muttered a curse under his breath and backed away. Next time, stay out of trouble. James said nothing. Because he knew there wouldn't be a next time. Men like Weston. They never forgot the moment they realized they were prey. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. The hum of the city had faded into the background. The distant horns, the rumbling of an old bus passing by, the occasional shout from a block away. Here in this alley, under the dim glow of a flickering streetlight, time seemed to slow. James' ghost, Carter, stood still, his breath steady, his body poised in a way that neither Officer Weston nor Officer Simmons could quite understand. Just seconds ago, they had been the ones in control, barking orders, taunting him, treating him as if he were less than nothing. But now, the balance of power had shifted. Officer Weston clenched his jaw, rubbing his wrist where James had grabbed him. He didn't want to admit it, not even to himself, but for the first time in a long time, he was afraid. It wasn't just the strength of the old man's grip. It was the way he moved, the way his body had coiled like a predator in that brief instant. Weston had dealt with plenty of criminals in his time. Thugs, gangsters, junkies, but this was different. Simmons felt it too. He had been uncomfortable from the moment he saw the war medals spill onto the ground. But now, standing beside his partner, he was beginning to understand what they had walked into. This wasn't just some random homeless guy. This man was dangerous. James inhaled deeply through his nose, exhaling through his mouth, a habit ingrained in him from years of military training. Control your breathing. Control your movements. Control your enemy. He had seen this before, this fear, the kind that creeps in when a man suddenly realizes he has made a mistake far beyond his comprehension. He had seen it in war zones, in the faces of enemy soldiers right before he pulled the trigger. It was the look of a man who just realized he wasn't the hunter, he was the prey. Weston tried to mask his fear with anger. You think you're tough. He spat, his voice not as steady as before. You think you can intimidate me? James didn't flinch, didn't blink. He just stood there watching. Weston reached for his baton. His fingers trembled just slightly. I should beat your ass right now, he growled. James tilted his head slightly, studying him the way a lion studies a wounded gazelle. You ever been in a real fight before, officer? Weston froze. The words weren't loud, weren't threatening. But there was something undeniably dangerous in them. Simmons shifted uncomfortably. Weston, maybe we should just. Shut up, Weston snapped. He wasn't thinking clearly anymore. His pride had been wounded, and men like Weston, they didn't handle that well. James saw it happening, the unraveling. Weston was fighting two battles now, one against James and one against his own crippling doubt. And James had already won the second one. James took a slow step forward. Weston instinctively took a step back. Just a small step, just an inch. But it was enough. James smirked. Thought so. Weston's face burned with humiliation. He was the cop. He was supposed to be in charge, to be the one making others step back, making others afraid. But this man, this old, broken man, wasn't afraid at all. Simmons saw the way Weston's hand twitched near his holster. Weston, he said sharply, his voice filled with warning. James noticed too. He sighed. Reaching for your gun now? He asked, shaking his head. That's your answer. Weston swallowed hard. He wanted to act, wanted to do something to reclaim control of the situation. But deep down, in some part of his brain he didn't want to acknowledge, he knew the truth. It wouldn't matter. Because even if he pulled his gun, even if he managed to aim it before James reached him, it wouldn't be fast enough. James had spent decades perfecting the art of the kill. He had taken out enemy snipers from over a mile away. He had dismantled entire teams of trained killers before they even realized he was there. If James Carter wanted to, he could take Weston's gun, break Weston's arm, and put him on the ground in less than 3 seconds. And there was nothing Weston could do about it. James took another step forward. Weston's breath hitched. His eyes darted around, as if looking for an escape. James shook his head. Go home, officer, he said quietly. Before you get hurt. Weston bristled. You threatening me? James chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent a shiver down Simmons' spine. Son, James said, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. If I was threatening you, you'd already know it. Simmons exhaled sharply, barely holding his composure. Weston, on the other hand, looked like he was about to explode. His pride, his ego, it was all crumbling. For a long moment, Weston didn't move. His hands clenched and unclenched, his jaw tightened and flexed. Then finally, he took a step back. Then another. James didn't move. He just watched. Weston turned sharply on his heel, shoving past Simmons. We're leaving, he muttered. His voice was unsteady. Simmons hesitated. He looked at James, then back at Weston. He could see it clearly now. Weston had lost. Not in a way that the world would see, not in a way that would be recorded on any police report. But in his soul, Weston knew. He had just met a real monster in the dark. And he had backed down. As the squad car sped off into the night, James bent down, picking up his green beret from the cold pavement. He dusted it off gently, his fingers lingering on the fabric. For a moment, he was back there, not in this alley, but on a battlefield, surrounded by brothers in arms who would have given their lives for him, just as he would have for them. He had fought for a country that had forgotten him, had bullied for a nation that now let him sleep in alleys and under bridges. But none of that mattered now, because he was still who he had always been. A warrior, a survivor, a ghost. James slung his duffel bag over his shoulder and stepped into the darkness, disappearing into the city streets like a shadow. Weston and Simmons would never forget this night, because some battles aren't fought with weapons. They're fought with presence. And James Carter had just won a war without firing a single shot. The cold night air wrapped around James' ghost Carter like an old friend as he stepped out of the alley. The distant wail of a siren echoed through the streets, a reminder that the world kept moving, even after moments like these. He didn't need to look back to know the two officers were gone. He could feel it in the stillness of the air, in the way the streets seemed quieter now. For men like Weston, this would be a night never spoken of, but never forgotten. The kind of encounter that lingers in the back of the mind, a whisper of fear that never quite fades. Weston would tell himself he had backed off because it wasn't worth it. Not because he was afraid, not because he had seen something in James's eyes that told him he wouldn't walk away from a real fight. But deep down, Weston would know the truth. Simmons, on the other hand, had learned something different. He had seen the edge of a world he had never stepped into, a world of men far more dangerous than a badge and a gun could protect against. He had seen a man who had long ago mastered the art of war, yet carried himself with a stillness that only came from absolute control. James hadn't threatened them. He hadn't needed to. Because some men don't have to show you who they are. You just know. James adjusted the strap on his duffel bag, his fingers brushing over the worn fabric of his old green beret. It had been with him through hell and back, a symbol of the life he had left behind, but could never truly escape. As he walked, his boots scuffing softly against the pavement, memories flickered through his mind like an old war film. He saw the jungles of Vietnam, where he had spent days stalking targets, waiting with the patience of a predator. He saw the deserts of the Middle East, where the sun had beat down on him as he lay prone for hours, sniper scope trained on an enemy compound. He saw the faces of the men he had fought alongside, some still alive, many long gone. And he saw the faces of the ones he had taken. That was the burden of men like him, to be a ghost even in life. The world had moved on without him. The country he had bullied for barely remembered his name. But that was the way of things. Soldiers fight, soldiers die, and the world forgets. But tonight had reminded him of something important. Even if the world forgot, he still remembered who he was. The streets were nearly empty now, save for a few late-night wanderers, other lost souls in a city that had no time for them. A man lay curled up near a closed storefront, wrapped in a thin blanket that did nothing against the biting cold. James paused for a moment, reaching into his bag and pulling out a small bundle of cash. He crouched down, tucking it beside the sleeping man without a word. It wasn't much, but it was something. The city didn't care about men like them, but he did. As James stood, he caught his reflection in a nearby shop window. His face was lined with years of hardship, his hair now more gray than black. He looked like any other old forgotten man wandering the streets. But appearances could be deceiving. He smirked slightly. That was the lesson those cops had learned tonight. James made his way toward the outskirts of the city, where the buildings thinned out and the lights weren't so harsh. He wasn't sure where he was going, not really. He never was. But he didn't need a destination. He had survived wars. He had survived the streets, and he would survive whatever came next. That was who he was. That was who he had always been. A ghost. And like a shadow in the night, he disappeared into the darkness, just as he always had. This is the harsh reality for many veterans in America. Men and women who have served their country with honor are often left forgotten, struggling to survive in the same streets they once protected. If this story moved you, don't just scroll past. Share this video, spread awareness, support organizations that help homeless veterans. And remember, not every homeless person is powerless. Some are warriors just waiting to be seen. Subscribe for more powerful stories.